Hi, doodads and doodads. It's Patrick from 8-Bit Doodads here with another video in our AppleTalk series. Today we're going to be adding several new computers into our network, connecting up using AppleTalk and being able to both print and eventually share files.
Say, kids, what time is it?
It's 8-Bit Doodads time!
As you can see, I've set up some of the computers that we used last time to establish the base network, and that was our Macintosh SE and an Apple Imagewriter with the AppleTalk option built into it. That allows the Mac SE to print to the printer, and that confirmed that our basic network was working. In today's video, we're going to be expanding that network. One of the things we're going to do is we're going to add an Apple II GS, and in fact, I have one set up over there, and you can see it running. But I just wanted to show you one of the reasons we're adding this is it has those AppleTalk ports built into it as well, as along with video out, and actually this particular model has an Ethernet port, which we may use in the future for not doing AppleTalk, but EtherTalk. That's a future video. Adding this onto the network requires a couple steps. One, obviously, is the physical connectivity. And that's done by adding another AppleTalk connector, or in our case, PhoneNet connector into the network. And in fact, I have one here. And I touched on this briefly in the history video. AppleTalk, Apple themselves provided these kind of boxes with two ports on them, but they used a more proprietary cable with a DIN 8 plug in it. And Fowleron and some others came out with these cables that use simple telephone, standard 4-wire telephone cables. And in fact, they only use two of the wires. And you can have these to be, I want to say almost any length, but there is a maximum limit of several hundred feet from end to end on here. One of the downsides of using this is you have to have a terminating resistor at both ends, whereas the Apple supply units, because of the extra cabling they had, they could self-terminate and the electronics in there. So we'll be plugging this in. The other steps we have to do, obviously, are we have to turn on AppleTalk inside the control panel of the GS, and we have to load the appropriate software. And I'm going to be going through those steps, and in fact, I'm going to show you some of the tools we use to get that established. In addition to setting up the GS and our AppleTalk connection, we're also going to be adding one or two more Macintoshes. This is a Macintosh Performa, which is a PowerPC unit. And like the GS, it has AppleTalk built into it, and monitor ports and SCSI ports, etc. But this was early enough in the Macintosh range, this did not have built-in Ethernet. So one, people still would have been using this to connect to laser writers or image writers with the AppleTalk built in to share printers or to share files in that network. You could get an option card for this machine to add a Ethernet port, because it does have a standard PCI slot in it, in a slightly weird configuration, but they did make available the drives. So we're going to add those two machines. And then I also have this machine, which is another PowerPC. This is a Power Macintosh G3. What makes this a little bit different is it also still has AppleTalk, which later generations of Macs stopped adding those ports to. This one still had it, but this one also has an Ethernet port. Why that becomes important is if you set up the services right on this machine, it can actually bridge AppleTalk to what's called EtherTalk, Apple's way of sharing between networks. And it could act as a bridge between the two networks, which would allow another Macintosh using Ethernet to actually route through this machine and get to our shared printer. Or with these two Macintoshes, I plan to set up file sharing. We could have modern Macintoshes today actually connect and access the file shares on here, along with our Mac SE will be able to access it, our Apple II GS, and you'll see over there an Apple IIe as well. We're going to be putting down the road an Apple Workstation card in there, which will give it the AppleTalk capability. Okay, for this next step, I've pulled out the GS that I have plugged in over here, and you can actually see it up on the screen up here. And what I'm going to do is I've actually already set this machine up with AppleTalk and plugged in, and we're going to print a document and see if it prints out to the Apple Imagewriter behind me. Just see how that it's all working. And once we have it working, I'm going to show you how all the steps I took to get it there. Now I am going to do lower quality, just print. And so it's now spooling this off to the Imagewriter, and hopefully behind us here, we'll see it start to print. It does take a few seconds. I think part of it is the GS actually has to compose the page, and then it has to send that document to the printer. Realize because it's an Imagewriter with the AppleTalk option, and it's shared by multiple users, it actually has to queue up documents. And so there's a little bit of buffer in there, and you can see it's establishing the communications. Now, to get this working, there was the part about plugging it into the network, and I'm going to show you how we did that. But there's also the setup of the machine. And that setup included turning AppleTalk on in the control panel, which I'm going to show you. And I'll enlarge the screen so you can see it a little bit better. But also getting the software installed. And that took a little bit of learning for me, because I just assumed, like on the Mac, you install the Macintosh software, it knows all about the printer. On the GS, installing the AppleTalk components is actually optional. And there are, you could use if you want to install the GS from the original floppies that would have come with GSOS. When you're doing that install, you could have selected the options to install AppleTalk Network. But if you're like me, you might have used an image, a hard drive image that you're booting from, that you've downloaded from the internet, and that might not have it installed, which was this case. So when we're done with this part, as I show you how to install it, I'm going to show you some of the other tools I use for manipulating hard drive images and getting the software loaded on here before we do the print. And we're still waiting for, I've got green lights on the printer. Let me make sure that I've got it plugged in. And there's the problem. I hadn't plugged in our AppleTalk cable. So, there we go. And this is the phone net cable that I plugged in. And let's make sure I plugged it into the right port. And I didn't. I've set up AppleTalk to use and there we go, the printer's printing now. So that actually tells you how good AppleTalk is from a user perspective. And even though I didn't have the plugged in yet, it was still working to try to print to the printer, and as soon as I plugged it in, you hear the printer going away. And this is the document that's printing out on the printer. Okay, so the document printed out. You can see that we have color on the screen. I just want to point this out. But the printout is black and white. The Imagewriter 2 actually supports color ribbons, but good luck getting them. So everything we're going to do will end up being in black and white. Later on, I'm hoping that we're going to be able to connect up my PostScript color laser printer. It's not a Apple Laserwriter or an Apple branded printer, and it doesn't actually have AppleTalk. But one of the down the road projects is to connect up NetTalk, which provides some print and file services, and it apparently has a way to pass through jobs, and we're going to see if that will give us full support of color and laser printing services. Now I'm going to, using the wrong mouse, I'm going to exit out of this window and bring us back to the desktop. So I want to show you a couple of things you have to do to set the system up. So we're back live on our GSOS desktop, and I'm going to show you the first thing you need to make sure you do when you're setting up the machine. We're going to go into the control panel, which we can do by holding down the Apple Control and Escape keys. And this allows us to go into the settings for a GS. Unlike an Apple IIe, which doesn't have any of this capability, they built into the ROM of the GS certain setups that are at that ROM level. So it stops whatever program is running, brings up a control panel. And the reason for this is so you can change some of the settings in the machine. And you can see display, change display, sound, what have you. One of the things is, what are the slots in the machine? An Apple II Series machine has typically 7 slots, and more or less, a lot of the slots are sort of defined. There's standards for what goes into each one. For instance, slot 6 usually was where the 5 1/4 inch floppy controller went. And most people put their printer interface in slot 1. And slot 3 was always the video part. On a GS, you can change some of the settings for the slots, because the GS, unlike the Apple IIe, has a lot of built-in functionality. On the bottom of it, where I showed you, we plugged in the AppleTalk connector, or their PhoneNet connector. There are 2 serial ports here. And if you set them to the system default, this would be the printer and a communications port in basically slot 1 and 2. There's a disk drive port, and this actually can be for 5 1/4 inch drives, which would be out of slot 6, or 3 1/2 inch drives, or even a hard drive, which would be out of slot 5. We have a mouse, which is, there you go. The mouse is off of the keyboard. Now, the keyboard doesn't take a slot, but the mouse for software compatibility is usually found in slot 4. Now, when you have the slots used like set to these built-in ports, then in most cases you can't use that same slot for something else. In the case of setting up the AppleTalk network, this is a ROM1 GS, which means that AppleTalk would be in slot 7. Now I could change this so it's my card, which means I could put something in there, and normally slot 7 would be used for a hard drive controller. In a GS, you could make it be this built-in AppleTalk. When you do that, you have to give up the slot 1 or slot 2 for your card. In fact, if I change that to be a modem, it tells me, oh, I can't do both a printer, a modem, and an AppleTalk. You have to decide which one you want. If I change slot 1 to be your card, then the AppleTalk uses that interface for slot 1 for itself. I'm going to go ahead and change this back. There we go. As you can see, slot 3 is the text display, the mouse, the smart port, what have you. So that's one thing you have to do, is you have to turn on AppleTalk in the ROM. This is sort of like a BIOS for a PC. That you have to set up certain settings, and you can turn things on and off. So we'll be done with that. You can do other things in here as well, like create a RAM disk using extra memory for a RAM disk. This system speed, an Apple IIgs actually runs about 3.5 times faster than an Apple IIe, but you can turn it down to run only at 1x. The two reasons why you would want to do that is, one, some games might be better playable at not a faster speed, while other games might be much better playable at a faster speed. But the other thing is, there's certain cards that you might have, like a Microsoft CPM card, that does not like running in the machine when it's running at high speed. And that's because of the way it shares memory. So I'll quit out of this. And if we come back here to the GSOS desktop, I'm going to bring up control panels for a second. And you'll see one of the things that's on here is Apple Share. We're going to get to that later. But we have Net Printer. And we can open up the Net Printer. And this is where I've selected Imagewriter. And you see which I've so uniquely named Imagewriter is the name of the printer. If we had more AppleTalk compatible printers on the network, they would be listed here. AppleTalk zones, I don't know if we're ever going to get into this, but if you have a very large network of AppleTalk, of machines on an AppleTalk network, you can actually put certain groups of devices into zones and name them in a zone. One of the things that some people might do is they might call something a printer zone and put all the printers in the printer zone. And that way you just click on printer. When you change the zone you're in, it shows you devices in that zone. The other thing they might do is, if you had, again, a very large network, if you had a whole bunch of PCs on one floor and some printers there, they might call that the third floor zone. And then on the fourth floor, have a fourth floor zone of those people and those printers. And it makes it easier for people to pick things. I just said something about the name of the printer called Imagewriter. There actually is a utility where you can come in here and bring up the printer, and I could rename the printer so it's not called Imagewriter anymore. If I had so if we called it Burt Rat Imagewriter, it'll actually go out and rename the printer. Now, anybody who has selected that printer as a default printer is going to have to reselect that printer. And in fact, we'll go back to Net Printer and we should be able to do that. So if we come back here to Net Printer and open, and you can see the printer's been renamed. So you could make that name something unique, like third floor printer or den printer or what have you. We actually, the network option, one of the things you can do, and we're going to go in another video way far down from this, is you can actually make this machine, instead of booting from the hard drive that's inside, make it boot from AppleTalk. If you have an AppleTalk server set up or an Apple filing protocol server set up, you can set an Apple II or an Apple IIgs to boot from that, and then you can determine whether it should boot. For an Apple IIe, it would always be ProDOS. For a GS, it could boot into ProDOS or it could boot into GSOS. And we will be demonstrating that down the road. Then that shows you how we had to, selecting the printer. But how did we get here? I'm going to go ahead and open up the machine. And show you I have very little inside. There we go. And I will switch our feed. So here's our machine, and you'll note there's only 3 cards in the machine. One very small one here. This is the memory card for the computer, and it's an 8. I was about to say 8 gigabytes. It's an 8 megabyte memory card, and we have here a reactive micro hard drive card. And what it really is, at the end of the day, this part of it is an IDE hard drive controller. And then sitting off the side of it in its IDE slot is a CF card to IDE interface. I also have here an Ethernet card. This is a Ethernet 2, which we'll be using down the road. There is a way to actually make this machine talk AppleTalk, but through Ethernet, and which would increase the speed of communication, sending files, and everything else. And I'm looking forward to experience that. The reason I'm pointing this card out, and I'm going to show you in a little bit, is getting the software on here. One of the easiest ways is to actually use your PC and plug it in a CF card reader. There's software on the PC which we're going to be using called CiderPress. It allows you to read and write files from an Apple formatted drive, so to speak, or an Apple partition CF card. And you can use it to back up the card. You can use it to download a pre-built image, which I've done. Or on this card, there happens to be 2 images, my running GSOS, but also the install package. And the reason for that is a lot of the images don't have AppleTalk turned on by default because not that many people have an AppleTalk network set up anymore. And so they didn't install the drivers and supporting software. So I'm going to show you how we went about doing that. Okay, so what we're going to do now is the software installation part for GS. And I actually want to try to do a full install on this so we can go through all the things you would do to install GSOS, enable AppleTalk networking, and setting it up to print and everything else. And the tools we're going to use, rather than sitting here and sticking a whole bunch of floppies into the drives and booting that way, is we're going to just remove our CF card, which is in a microdrive turbo. This is a 256 meg card that has 4 32 meg partitions on it. And we're going to stick it into our Windows card reader. And then you can see we have CiderPress on the screen. And I can open up that volume, and you can see our drives on our Windows machine listed. And this last drive, removable non-Windows format, that's because it's the native microdrive turbo format, and CiderPress is very happy to deal with that. And we can open up that volume. It's reading the CF card, and you'll see on our left with all of the volume names, directory, subdirectory, and then finally the file names. And this lists all 4 of the volumes that were on the card. Now, if I close that, and we come back over here to something called volume copier, because before I do anything else, and because we're going to be starting new, so to speak, I want to make a backup of the drive. And the way you can do that is bring up the volume copier, and you will see again the drives, and we're going to open up that drive. And in this case, it's really just showing you the partition table that's on that CF card. And I can come here and I can pick any of those volumes, and I can copy that single ProDOS volume to a file. The reason you might want to do that is it allows you to take that copy and use it in an Apple emulator like Apple Win. Or you could copy it to another device, a USB stick or whatever, if you're moving between, say, a microdrive turbo and a CFFA, or if you're moving from this to a floppy EMU or a booty. You can use CiderPress to copy the volumes from one device to another. We can also, if I select the microdrive at the top and copy that to a file, what this is going to do is back up the entire drive. And I'll just put that in my downloads, and we'll call it microdrive turbo backup. And we'll call it July. And so now it's reading all of the volumes off of that CF card, and it's putting them into one backup file, which you could then restore again to a microdrive turbo. Now, it's copying this whole thing as one blob. If you want to manipulate individual volumes, then you would want to back up each of these individually so they could be used in an emulator. Whereas this file probably could only be used to restore the entire CF card. This would be a way to make backup, copy one CF card to another if you had more than one of these devices. Now, the next thing I want to do is I want to load a volume on here. And you'll notice I was able to copy to file, but I can't load from the file. The reason being is I'm going to close this off again, and we're going to go right back to the same place of the volume copier. When you open it up, there's a little checkbox here, and the default is to open it in read-only mode, meaning you can only read from the card, but you can't write anything to the card. So if I open it in read-write mode, and now select that same item again, you'll notice now the load from file works. And what I want to do here is I have an image here called live install, and I can load that from a file. And that will bring up images that we have. And there happens to be one of the images that I have here is a hard drive / CD looking thing that has all of the installation files for a GS. And so we can load that into one of our 4 volumes on the microdrive turbo. And we can, at boot up, say we want to start from that particular device. And then we can use it to install the software on one of the others. And so we're writing out that to the card. When this is done, I'm going to put it back in the machine, and I'll switch over to a live screen of the GS running booted from that particular volume we just copied out there. All right, I've put the CF card back in the machine, and I'm going to turn it on, but as I'm doing so, I'm going to hold down the Apple key and turn on the machine, and you'll see the GS is booting up. On a microdrive turbo, if you hold down the Apple key, it allows you to change which of the volumes is booted. And that live install is in slot 2, so to speak. It's the second volume on the disk. So we can press the 2 key, and it will boot from that. And you see it boots pretty quickly. As a live install disk, sort of like in Linux, how they have disks that run right from it. This is sort of like one of those images, and it's special in that when the first time you run it, if it's truly a clean install, it'll come up and ask you for the username, and we'll put in here doodad, and it uses that to name the machine for being on the AppleTalk network, or for naming the machine for the user. This will finish booting, and then we're going to run the install scripts that come with the live install, and we're going to tell it to put a brand new fresh copy of GSOS in volume 1 or slot 1, if you will, of the microdrive turbo. And in fact, I'll point out here on the screen, you can see live install is at the top, and then it's GS hard drive, and then we've got two ProDOS partitions. If you were to look on the microdrive turbo, this would actually be considered partition 1 and that partition 2. But by holding the Apple key and hitting 2, it sort of switches them for this one-time boot. And in fact, when we're done with the live install, we're going to reboot, and you're going to see it's going to boot from the other one, and they'll be switched back into their normal spaces. So I've clicked on the live install, and actually they've made this super easy. All we have to do is click this easy update button because it's already set for the volume I want it to install on, since that's the next one in line. And I'll click the easy update and let it go. This will take a couple minutes. It's going to install all the base GSOS software, System Finder, fonts, etc. And it'll also install AppleTalk, AppleShare, the drivers for our Imagewriter printer that we've been using to test. And as I said, it also installs the AppleShare stuff, which is going to be our next project, connecting up an AppleShare server to the system and moving files back and forth between the GSOS and Macintoshes, and eventually the PCs. I'm going to let this run. We'll probably skip ahead in the video, so you don't have to wait the whole time. Okay, you can see it's successfully installed everything. I'm going to say okay. I'm going to quit the installer. I'll close our window for that drive, and I'm going to come here and say shut down, which will give us the option to do a restart. And we'll do a restart. And so this is going to reboot the computer. And while this looks exactly the same, it's because it's the same version of the software. It's now booting off of that first partition that contains the software we just installed. It's no longer the live CD, but our actual running system. Once this is all done, we can go in and reformat that live install, and you see now it's the second one on the screen, and we're booting off our main system. We could reformat that and use that for data space, installing applications or games or what have you. Now, to see if it's done what we wanted, which was to get the AppleTalk drivers and software on there, we're going to go to Control Panel, and you can see all the control panels. And in fact, there's AppleShare, which we'll be using in the future. And down here is Net Printer. So we're going to open that one up. That's similar to Chooser on a Macintosh. And it's showing us the printer types. We have an Imagewriter. And there you can see our Burt Rat Imagewriter, which we renamed earlier in the video. And so we can print that. Our user is Doodad. Remember when we first booted that live CD, it asked us a username, so it's already pre-programmed that into the system for us. So we have the printer working. We have the GS working with fresh software on it, and it's tied into the AppleTalk network. I hope you enjoyed this video. The next one in the series, which might land sooner rather than later, is the two Macintoshes that I showed you earlier. Both of them are going to become Apple file servers, Apple share file servers, if you will. So stay tuned, and if you like this, hit the like button and visit us on 8bitdoodads.com.